Sometimes the world breaks us in ways that make us believe we're unworthy of love. At 43, Frieda had learned this truth the hard way, locked away by her own village for being different, for speaking truths they couldn't bear to hear. In the fog-shrouded mountains of Ravenshollow, the townspeople whispered that she was too wild, too dangerous for any decent man. They called her witch and prepared to burn her alive. But Count Drake, an ancient vampire who had lived centuries in lonely darkness, saw something else entirely. When he emerged from his crumbling castle and looked into Frieda's defiant eyes, something stirred in his dead heart. He made his claim not for mercy, but because her fierce spirit called to his own wounded soul. But would claiming this untamed woman be their salvation or their destruction? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The village of Ravenshollow clung to the mountainside like a drowning man grasps driftwood, desperate, precarious, and always one storm away from disaster. Fog rolled through its narrow cobblestone streets with the persistence of unwelcome truth, carrying whispers that seemed to seep through the very stones of the ancient buildings. Here, in this forgotten corner of the world where superstition held more sway than reason, the old ways lived on with stubborn tenacity. Frieda Blackwood had called this place home for 43 years, though home was perhaps too generous a word for a place that had grown to fear her very existence. She remembered when things had been different, when the villagers had welcomed her herb garden and her healing touch, when mothers brought their fevered children to her door in the dark hours before dawn, when her knowledge of the old remedies was considered a blessing rather than a curse. Those days felt like memories from another lifetime now. The trouble had begun slowly, as most troubles do. A failed harvest here, a sudden death there, a birth gone wrong despite her ministrations. In a place where cause and effect were often strangers to logic, Frieda had become the convenient explanation for all of Ravenshallow's misfortunes. Her unmarried state, once accepted as the choice of an independent woman, had transformed into evidence of her unnaturalness. Her knowledge of herbs and healing, passed down through generations of wise women, had become proof of dark dealings with forces better left unnamed. Father Matthias, the village priest, had arrived 3 years ago with fire in his sermons and fear in his heart. Where his predecessor had been content to tend his flock with gentle guidance, Matthias preached of corruption and purification, of the dangers that lurked in the shadows of their mountain community. His pale eyes had fixed on Frieda from his first Sunday sermon, and she had known with the certainty that comes with years of hard-earned wisdom that her time was running short. The accusations had started as whispers. Frieda practices the old ways. Frieda talks to her plants as if they understand. Frieda has never taken a husband. What decent woman reaches her age without children? The whispers had grown into murmurs, the murmurs into pointed conversations, and finally into open declarations of suspicion and fear. 6 months ago, when young Thomas Miller had died despite her best efforts to heal his consumption, the whispers had become shouts. 3 months ago, when the harvest had failed despite a promising growing season, the shouts had become accusations. Last week, when Margaret Foster's baby had been born with a withered arm, the accusations had become a demand for justice. They had come for her at dawn. These people she had known since childhood, carrying ropes and fear in equal measure. Frieda had not resisted. What would have been the point? In a place where logic held no sway, resistance would only have been seen as further proof of her guilt. The iron shackles that now bound her wrists had been forged in the village. Smithy, heavy, crude things that rubbed her skin raw and served as a constant reminder of how completely her world had changed. They chained her in the village square like a wild animal, and perhaps that's what she had become in their eyes. Too wild to marry, too dangerous to live, too different to understand. High above the village, where the mountain peaks pierced the perpetual fog like ancient spears thrust toward heaven, Thornwick Castle stood in magnificent decay. Once, it had been the seat of power for this entire region, its towers proud and strong, its walls unyielding. Now, after centuries of neglect, it was a shadow of its former glory. Stones had fallen from its walls, vines claimed its battlements, and silence filled its halls like water fills a tomb. For 300 years, the castle had been home to Count Drake Thornwick, though few in the village below remembered his true name or his true nature. To them, he had become simply the Count, a figure of legend and fear who occasionally appeared in the village like a wraith, conducting business with cold efficiency before disappearing back into his mountain fortress. They did not know that Drake had once been human, that he had walked these same mountain paths as a young man with dreams of love and legacy. They did not know that he had been transformed against his will on a night when the moon was dark and his human life had ended in a wash of blood and betrayal. They could not imagine the weight of centuries pressing down on a soul that remembered what it meant to feel the warmth of sunlight on human skin. The portrait that hung in the main hall of Thornwick Castle showed what Drake had lost, a family painting commissioned in happier times, when he had been merely the young lord of a prosperous estate. His wife, Elena, smiled from the canvas with eyes that held all the warmth the world could offer. Their children, Margaret and Thomas, gazed out with the innocent joy that only the young can possess. All of them had been dead for 3 centuries now, claimed by the plague that had swept through the region like a reaper's scythe, leaving Drake alone with his grief and his curse. In those early years after his transformation, Drake had raged against his fate. He had sought ways to end his existence, to join his family in whatever realm awaited beyond this life. But vampires, he had learned, were notoriously difficult to kill and even more difficult to keep dead. Eventually, rage had given way to numbness, numbness to resignation, and resignation to a kind of hollow acceptance that masqueraded as peace. He had fed when necessary, taking only what he needed from travelers who passed through the mountain roads and would not be missed. He had avoided the village below, wanting no part of human affairs or human connections. What was the point of forming bonds with creatures who would age and die while he remained unchanged? Better to exist in solitude than to endure the pain of watching mortality claim those he might come to care for. The castle had fallen into disrepair around him, and Drake had let it. What need did a dead man have for grandeur? The servants had died or departed decades ago, leaving him alone with his memories and his regret. He had become a caretaker of his own tomb, a guardian of a legacy that no longer held meaning. But even the dead, it seemed, could not entirely escape the pull of the living world. The whispers from the village below had reached even his isolated domain. Whispers of a woman who spoke truth when others preferred comfortable lies, who healed with hands that held generations of knowledge, who refused to bow to fear and superstition. The descriptions of this Frieda Blackwood had stirred something in Drake's chest that he had thought long buried curiosity, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit who refused to be broken by a world that demanded conformity. From his tower window, Drake could see the village square clearly. He had watched them build the holding cell, had observed the preparations for what the priest called purification, but what any reasonable mind would recognize as murder. He had seen them drag Frieda to her prison, had witnessed the dignity with which she bore their hatred and fear. Something about the way she held herself, even in chains, reminded him of Elena, not in appearance, for Frieda was wild where Elena had been refined, weathered where Elena had been sheltered but in spirit. Both women possessed a strength that could not be broken by circumstance, a fire that burned too bright to be easily extinguished. For the first time in decades, Drake felt something stir in the cold depths of his chest. Not hunger, he had long ago learned to manage that particular need. Not loneliness, he had made peace with solitude years before. This was something else, something he had thought lost forever when the plague had claimed his family and his humanity. It was hope. The villagers spoke of Frieda as too wild to marry, too dangerous to live. They saw her strength as a threat, her independence as unnatural, her knowledge as corruption. But Drake, who had lived long enough to see empires rise and fall, who had witnessed the full spectrum of human nature in all its glory and horror, saw something different entirely. He saw a woman who, like himself, had been judged by those too small to understand her worth. He saw someone who had faced the world's cruelty with courage rather than surrender, who had chosen to remain true to herself, even when that choice led to condemnation and death. Most importantly, he saw someone who might understand what it meant to be cast out, to be feared for being different, to be alone in a world that had no place for those who refused to conform. As night fell over Ravenshollow and the fog grew thicker, Drake made a decision that would change both their lives forever. For the first time in 3 centuries, he would leave his castle not out of necessity, but out of choice. For the first time since his transformation, he would involve himself in human affairs not as a predator, but as something else entirely. He would claim Frieda Blackwood, not because he needed her, but because perhaps, just perhaps, she needed him as much as he was beginning to realize he needed her. The ancient laws still held power in these forgotten places, laws that predated the priest's Christian doctrine by millennia, laws that gave certain beings the right to claim protection over those whom society had abandoned. Drake had never invoked such laws before, had never seen the need. But as he prepared to descend from his mountain fortress, as he donned the formal attire befitting his station and his intentions, Drake felt something he had not experienced since his human days' anticipation. Not just for the rescue he planned to execute, but for what might come after. For the possibility that in saving Frieda Blackwood, he might somehow save something in himself that he had thought lost forever. The fog swirled around Thornwick Castle as if responding to its master's stirring emotions. In the village below, a woman waited in chains for a dawn that would bring her death. Above, a man who was no longer quite a man, prepared to challenge fate itself for the chance at something he had not dared to hope for in 300 years. Their stories, which had run parallel for so long, were about to converge in ways that would transform them both. Dawn came to Ravenshollow like a reluctant witness, creeping through the fog with pale fingers that seemed to shrink from what they might illuminate. In the village square, the pyre stood ready, a monument to fear dressed up as righteousness. The wood had been stacked with meticulous care, each log placed with the precision of men who wanted to ensure their terrible work would be completed quickly and thoroughly. Father Matthias stood before the assembled villagers, his black robes stark against the grey morning mist. His voice carried across the square with the fervour of absolute certainty, each word falling like hammer blows on the ears of those who had come to witness what they called justice. "We gather this morning not in hatred but in love," he proclaimed, his pale eyes reflecting the torchlight with an unsettling intensity. "Love for our community, love for our children, love for the purity that God demands of his faithful. The woman who sits before you has corrupted this love with her dark practices, has turned the gifts of nature into instruments of evil. Today, we reclaim our village from the shadow that has fallen across it." Frieda sat in her iron shackles at the base of the pyre, her auburn hair catching what little light penetrated the morning gloom. She had not slept during her final night. How could she, with the sound of hammering as they built her death echoing through the darkness? Instead, she had spent the hours remembering. The feel of soil beneath her fingers as she tended her garden. The grateful smile of a mother whose child she had helped bring safely into the world. The satisfaction of watching her herbs grow strong and healthy under her care. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear, though it lived in her chest like a cold stone. Fear not of death itself. She had made peace with mortality long ago, but of dying for the crime of being herself, of refusing to become small enough for their comfort. "Do you have any final words, witch?" "Witch?" Father Matthias asked, his voice carrying across the square with theatrical gravity. "Any confession of your sins against God and this community?" Frieda raised her head, meeting the eyes of villagers she had known since childhood. Margaret Foster, whose baby she had delivered only weeks ago, looked away in shame. Thomas Miller's father stood with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, his grief for his son twisted into something sharp and hungry for revenge. Even young Sarah Chen, whom Frieda had taught to read herbs, stared at her with fear-bright eyes. "My only sin," Frieda said, her voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness, "has been believing that knowledge and independence were gifts rather than curses. If you must burn me for refusing to be less than what I am, then so be it. But know this, the herbs will still grow, the seasons will still turn, and your children will still fall ill without someone who understands the old ways to help them." Her words hit the crowd like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples of unease through their ranks. Some shifted uncomfortably, remembering her kindnesses. Others hardened their faces further, as if her calm dignity were itself a form of witchcraft designed to weaken their resolve. Father Matthias raised his torch high. "Let the purification begin." The first flames caught quickly, fed by the dry kindling that had been arranged around the base of the pyre. Frieda closed her eyes and thought of her garden, of the countless lives she had touched with healing, of the knowledge that would die with her. The heat began to build, and smoke stung her nostrils. Then the world changed. A wind rose from nowhere, carrying with it a cold that cut through the morning warmth like a blade. The flames wavered and danced, and the fog that had been content to drift lazily through the village streets began to swirl and coalesce into something almost solid. The villagers murmured in confusion and growing fear as the temperature dropped with unnatural speed. From the mist stepped a figure that made the breath catch in every throat present. Count Drake Thornwick moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his long black coat billowing behind him like wings. His dark hair was pulled back to reveal features that might have been carved from marble, beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful, terrible in their perfection. But it was his eyes that truly commanded attention, crimson as fresh blood and ancient as the mountains themselves. The villagers pressed back against each other, their courage evaporating like morning dew. They had heard stories of the Count, whispered tales passed down through generations, but seeing him in the flesh was like confronting a legend made manifest. "Cease this foolishness," Drake commanded, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to resonate in the very bones of those who heard it. "You will not burn this woman." Father Matthias stepped forward, his torch wavering in his grip, but his voice steady with religious fervor. "You have no authority here, creature of darkness. This is God's work, and no demon shall. I invoke the right of ancient claim," Drake interrupted, his words cutting through the priest's protests like a sword through parchment. "By laws older than your faith, older than your village, older than the memories of your grandfather's grandfathers, I claim protection over this woman." The words seemed to hang in the air with weight and power. These were laws from a time when the world was younger and stranger, when supernatural beings walked openly among mortals and ancient compacts governed the relationships between species. Most had forgotten such things existed, but the power in Drake's voice made them real again. "What claim could you possibly have?" Father Matthias demanded, though his voice now held a note of uncertainty. Drake's eyes found Frieda's, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, understanding, a connection that transcended the supernatural circumstances of their meeting. "She is mine," Drake said simply. "I claim her as my chosen companion, under the ancient laws that govern such bonds. Any who would harm her must first answer to me." The villagers gasped at this pronouncement. A few crossed themselves, others muttered prayers, and still others simply stared in shock at the implications of what they had just witnessed. Frieda felt her heart stop, then begin again with a rhythm that seemed to echo Drake's words. She studied his face, searching for the deception or manipulation she expected to find. Instead, she saw something that shocked her sincerity. This ancient being, this creature of legend and nightmare, was offering her genuine protection, not for his own gain, but because something in her had called to something in him. "You would claim a witch?" Father Matthias sputtered. "A creature of evil and corruption?" "I see no witch," Drake replied, stepping closer to the pyre. The flames parted before him as if afraid to touch his presence. "I see a woman of knowledge and strength who has been condemned for refusing to diminish herself to comfort others. I see someone who understands that being different is not the same as being evil." With movements too quick for mortal eyes to follow clearly, Drake was beside the pyre. The iron shackles that held Frieda crumbled at his touch like rust, their metal unable to withstand the supernatural force he brought to bear. She felt his hands on her shoulders, surprisingly gentle for all their obvious strength, helping her to her feet. "Do you accept my protection?" he asked softly, his voice meant for her ears alone. "I offer it freely, with no chains to replace the ones I break." Frieda looked into his crimson eyes and saw centuries of loneliness, of isolation, of existing without truly living. She saw a kindred spirit who had been cast out by the world for being what he was, rather than what others wished him to be. Most of all, she saw the question he was truly asking, not just whether she would accept his protection, but whether she could accept him, monster and all. "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying more weight than any vow she had ever spoken. Drake swept his coat around her shoulders, enveloping her in warmth and safety. The villagers watched in stunned silence as he lifted her in his arms with effortless ease, holding her as if she were made of spun glass and starlight. "This woman is under my protection now," Drake announced to the crowd. "By ancient right and sacred law, she belongs to my household. Any who seek to harm her will find themselves answering to me, and I assure you that is not a conversation you would survive." Father Matthias raised his torch again, but his hand shook with impotent rage. "This is not over, demon. God's justice will not be denied by your dark magic." Drake's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Perhaps, but today justice takes a different form than the one you planned." With that, he turned and walked away from the village square, carrying Frieda into the swirling mist. The fog seemed to embrace them, wrapping around their forms until they vanished from sight, like figures from a half-remembered dream. Behind them, the pyre continued to burn, but its flames now seemed hollow and purposeless. The villagers stood in uncertain silence, unsure what had just transpired, but certain that their world had shifted in ways they could not yet understand. In Father Matthias's eyes, a new kind of fire kindled, one that would prove far more dangerous than any pyre. The journey to Thornwick Castle passed in a dreamlike haze for Frieda. Wrapped in Drake's coat, she felt the supernatural speed with which he moved through the mountain paths, the world blurring around them, until only the steady rhythm of his steps and the warmth of his arms remained real. When the mist finally cleared and the castle loomed before them, she gasped at the sight. Thornwick Castle was a study in contradictions, magnificent in its bones, yet heartbreaking in its decay. The massive stone walls still stood proud against the mountain sky, their weathered surfaces speaking of centuries spent defying wind and weather. Ivy claimed much of the lower walls, and several of the tower windows gaped empty like hollow eyes, but the structure itself remained sound, as if held together by sheer force of will and memory. Drake set her down gently at the main gates, and Frieda noticed how his hands lingered a moment longer than necessary before pulling away. "Welcome to my home," he said, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely certain it deserved that name anymore. The great doors groaned open at his touch, revealing an entrance hall that took Frieda's breath away. Despite the dust and neglect, she could see what this place had once been. The vaulted ceiling soared overhead, supported by carved stone pillars that depicted scenes of medieval life, harvest festivals, hunts, celebrations that had taken place when this castle was the beating heart of a thriving community. Tapestries still hung on the walls, their colors faded, but their craftsmanship unmistakable. "It's beautiful," Frieda whispered, and meant it. Where others might have seen only ruin and abandonment, she saw potential, saw what could be restored with time and care. Drake studied her face, seeming surprised by her reaction. Beautiful is not a word that has been applied to this place in quite some time. Most would call it cursed or haunted. "Perhaps it's both," Frieda replied, running her fingers along a carved banister worn smooth by centuries of use. "But that doesn't make it less beautiful. Sometimes the most interesting places are the ones that carry their scars openly." Something shifted in Drake's expression at her words. A flicker of vulnerability quickly hidden, but not quite fast enough to escape her notice. She realized he was not just showing her his home, but revealing something about himself, his isolation, his acceptance of decay, his resignation to existing rather than truly living. From the small leather pouch that had survived her imprisonment, Frieda withdrew a handful of dried herbs, chamomile, lavender, a few sprigs of rosemary that still held their fragrance. It was all she had left of her former life, her tools of healing reduced to this meager collection. She clutched them like talismans, drawing comfort from their familiar scents and textures. "You kept those through everything?" Drake asked, noticing her careful handling of the herbs. "They're all I have left of who I was," she said simply. "My connection to the earth, to healing, to the knowledge passed down through generations of wise women. I couldn't bear to lose them entirely." Drake led her through halls lined with portraits of long-dead nobles, their painted eyes seeming to follow their passage with curiosity or judgment. Dust motes danced in shafts of pale sunlight that filtered through grimy windows, and their footsteps echoed in the vast spaces like whispered conversations between past and present. "Are you hungry?" Drake asked, pausing at the entrance to what had once been a grand dining hall. The question seemed to surprise him as much as it did her, as if the concept of hospitality was something he had to consciously remember. Frieda realized she hadn't eaten since before her imprisonment, but hunger seemed like such a mundane concern after everything that had transpired. "Still," she nodded, and Drake's relief at having something concrete to do for her was almost endearing. The kitchen was a cavernous space dominated by a massive stone hearth that looked as if it hadn't held a fire in years. Dust-covered pots and pans hung from iron hooks, and pantries that had once held provisions for an entire household stood empty and echoing. "I'm afraid I'm not well equipped for mortal needs," Drake admitted, running a hand through his dark hair in what Frieda was beginning to recognize as a gesture of uncertainty. "It has been some time since I've had to consider such things." "Then, perhaps it's time to remember," Frieda said gently. She began exploring the kitchen with the practical eye of someone accustomed to making do with limited resources. In one pantry, she found stores of grain and preserved goods that, while old, were still edible thanks to the castle's cool, dry air. You must have some way of maintaining supplies, even if you don't eat solid food yourself. Drake watched her work with fascination, as if seeing the simple act of food preparation for the first time. "There are arrangements with merchants from distant towns," he said. "They deliver what I request and ask no questions in exchange for gold that has no meaning to me." As Frieda busied herself preparing a simple meal, Drake found himself studying her with growing intensity. The way she moved through his kitchen with quiet confidence, making herself at home in spaces that had known only solitude for decades. The careful way she handled her precious herbs, as if each one held not just medicinal properties, but memories and meaning, the complete absence of fear in her manner, despite being alone with a creature that could end her life without effort. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" he asked suddenly, the question seeming to escape without his permission. Frieda paused in her stirring, considering her answer carefully. "Perhaps because I recognize something in you that others have missed," she said finally. "You saved me when you could have simply watched me burn. You offer me shelter when you could have left me to fend for myself. You ask about my needs when you have no obligation to care. These are not the actions of a monster. You don't know what I am, Drake said, his voice carrying a warning. What I've done, what I've taken, what I am capable of. No, Frieda agreed, meeting his crimson gaze steadily. But I know what you choose to be in this moment, with me. That matters more than your past or your nature. Drake fell silent, clearly struggling with concepts he hadn't had to confront in centuries. The idea that someone might judge him by his actions rather than his curse, that someone might see potential for good in a creature defined by darkness. As evening fell and they shared the simple meal Frieda had prepared, an unexpected intimacy settled between them. Not romantic, not yet, but something deeper, the recognition of two souls who had been cast out by the world and found themselves, against all odds, in the company of someone who might understand. Tell me about your herbs, Drake said as Frieda carefully sorted through her small collection. What do they do? Frieda's face lit up with genuine pleasure at the question. This is chamomile, she said, holding up a small flower head. It soothes nerves and helps with sleep. Lavender for headaches and anxiety. Rosemary for memory and circulation. She paused, studying his face. Though I suppose your needs are different from those I'm accustomed to treating. Perhaps, Drake said thoughtfully, but it has been a very long time since anyone has offered me any form of healing. As the night deepened around them, both began to realize that their arrangement, his protection, her sanctuary, might become something neither had expected. In the vast loneliness of the castle, two wounded souls had found each other, and that discovery held possibilities that both terrified and thrilled them. The next morning brought with it a transformation that Drake could never have anticipated. He woke, if his periods of rest could truly be called, sleep to the sound of activity, echoing through halls that had known only silence for decades. Following the sounds, he found Frieda in what had once been the castle's herb garden, her sleeves rolled up and dirt already staining her hands as she worked among the overgrown beds. The garden was a heartbreaking sight, a testament to abandonment and the inexorable passage of time. What had once been carefully cultivated rows of medicinal plants and culinary herbs had long since given way to weeds and wild growth. Yet even in its neglected state, Drake could see signs of the garden's former glory. Hardy perennials pushed through the tangle of invasive vines, and fruit trees that had not been pruned in decades still bore small, wild fruit. Frieda worked with the focused intensity of someone who had found her calling. She pulled weeds with careful discrimination, preserving the volunteer herbs that had managed to survive while clearing away the choking overgrowth. Her movements were economical and sure, born of years spent coaxing life from reluctant soil. "You don't have to do this," Drake said, though something in his chest tightened as he watched her gentle hands nurture plants back toward health. "Yes, I do," Frieda replied without looking up from her work. "A garden like this doesn't die. Easily see how the time has spread here. And these lavender bushes, they just need pruning and care to flourish again. This place wants to live, Drake. It's just been waiting for someone to remember how to help it." Drake found himself kneeling beside her without conscious decision, his hands joining hers in the earth. The sensation was strange after so many years of avoiding such simple, life-affirming activities. Soil under his fingernails felt foreign, yet oddly comforting, a connection to growing things that his vampire nature had long since abandoned. "Tell me about before," Frieda said as they worked side by side. "Before you became what you are now, you mentioned a family once." The question hit Drake like a physical blow, and for a moment his hands stilled in the earth. He had not spoken of his human life in decades, had trained himself to think of it as little as possible. The memories were too painful, too sharp with loss. "I was married," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Elena was her name. We had 2 children, Margaret and Thomas. They died in the plague of 1432, all 3 of them within a single week. I was transformed shortly after, by someone who thought eternal life would be a gift to ease my grief. Frieda's hands paused in their work, her attention fully focused on him despite the careful way he spoke, as if the words themselves were made of glass. "They were wrong," she said gently. "Whoever did this to you, immortality isn't a gift when it means watching everyone you love slip away while you remain unchanged." "How do you know that?" Drake asked, surprised by the depth of understanding in her voice. "Because I've seen what happens to people who can't let go of their grief," Frieda replied. "In my years as a healer, I've watched mothers lose children, husbands lose wives, children lose parents. Some find ways to carry their love forward into new relationships, new purposes. Others," she gestured around the neglected garden, "others build walls around their hearts and let everything else wither." The truth of her words settled between them like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples through thoughts and feelings Drake had kept carefully buried for centuries. He realized that in his determination to avoid further loss, he had also avoided the possibility of finding anything worth keeping. "What about you?" he asked, deflecting attention from his own painful revelations. "You said the village feared you because you never married. Was there never anyone who caught your interest?" Frieda's laugh held a note of old sadness. "Oh, there were suitors in my younger days. Good men, most of them, who would have given me comfortable lives and expected me to be grateful for the privilege. But they wanted me to be smaller than I was, quieter, more conventional. They loved the idea of taming the wild healer, of making me safe and domestic." She pulled up a particularly stubborn weed with more force than necessary. "I chose my herbs and my healing over their comfort. I chose to remain true to myself rather than diminish myself for love. The village called it unnatural, said I was too wild to marry. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps," Drake said carefully, "they simply weren't worthy of what you had to offer." Their eyes met across the garden bed, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared experience, of understanding what it meant to be judged for refusing to conform to others' expectations. In that moment, the space between them seemed charged with possibility. As days passed, Frieda's presence began to transform more than just the garden. She tackled the castle's neglected spaces with the same gentle determination she brought to her healing work. She opened windows that had been shuttered for years, letting light and fresh air flow through rooms that had become tombs of memory. She cleaned and organized with respect for the castle's history, preserving rather than replacing, restoring rather than renovating. Drake found himself drawn to watch her work, fascinated by the way she approached each space as if it held potential rather than just problems. She hummed while she cleaned, soft melodies that seemed to awaken the very stones of the castle. Under her care, the great hall began to remember its former dignity, and the library emerged from beneath layers of dust to reveal treasures Drake had forgotten he possessed. "You're bringing this place back to life," he observed one evening, as they sat before the first fire the main hearth had held in decades. "No," Frieda corrected gently. "I'm just helping it remember what it was meant to be. Life was always here, Drake. It was just sleeping, waiting for someone to care enough to wake it up." As she spoke, Drake realized she might be talking about more than just the castle. The careful way she looked at him, the patience with which she drew him into conversations about his past, the gentle manner in which she included him in her daily activities, all of it suggested she saw the same potential for renewal in him that she saw in every neglected corner of his home. For the first time in centuries, Drake began to wonder if he, too, might be capable of something more than mere existence. In Frieda's presence, he felt echoes of the man he had once been, stirrings of emotions he had thought permanently buried. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Outside the castle walls, the village of Ravenshollow continued its daily routines, but whispers of the supernatural rescue had begun to spread. Some spoke of the witch who had escaped divine justice, others of the ancient power that had intervened. In his chambers, Father Matthias plotted and planned, his obsession with purification growing stronger with each passing day. But within Thornwick Castle, two wounded souls continued their careful dance around each other, each day bringing them closer to acknowledging what was growing between them. A week into Frieda's residence at Thornwick Castle, Drake made a decision that surprised even himself. Leading her to his private study, a room he had not shared with another soul in over 2 centuries, he withdrew a leather-bound journal from a locked drawer. The book was thick with age, its pages yellowed and brittle, filled with his careful script documenting the long years of his existence. "I want you to understand what you've involved yourself with," he said, placing the journal on the desk between them. "What I was, what I became, what I've done in the centuries since my transformation." Frieda approached the journal with the same reverence. She showed her healing herbs, recognizing the weight of trust Drake was placing in her. The pages chronicled not just events but emotions, the raw agony of losing his family, the confusion and horror of his transformation, the gradual numbing of his heart as decades stretched into centuries. "You were turned against your will," she observed, reading entries that detailed his early struggles with his vampiric nature. "By someone you trusted." Drake's jaw tightened at the memory. "My closest friend, Marcus. He thought he was saving me from suicide, from the grief that was consuming me after Elena's death. He couldn't understand that some losses are meant to be felt fully, that healing requires time and acceptance, not the forced numbness of immortality." As Frieda read, she discovered the full scope of Drake's isolation. Entries spanning decades described his withdrawal from human contact, his decision to feed only on animals rather than risk forming connections with potential victims, his gradual retreat into the castle that had become both sanctuary and prison. "You've been punishing yourself," she said softly, looking up from a particularly heartbreaking passage about his guilt over outliving his children. "For 300 years, you've been atoning for the sin of surviving when they couldn't." "Shouldn't I?" Drake asked, his voice raw with old pain. "What right do I have to happiness when they lie cold in the ground?" "The same right any parent has to continue, living after losing a child," Frieda replied with the gentle authority of someone who had counseled the grieving. "Love doesn't die with the beloved, Drake. It transforms, becomes something you carry forward, rather than something that chains you to the past." Their conversations that evening and many that followed revealed the gradual erosion of Drake's humanity. Not his physical humanity that had been taken in a single night, but his emotional connection to life, hope, joy. He had become a caretaker of memories rather than a creator of new experiences. As trust deepened between them, their partnership in restoring the castle became more natural and intimate. They worked together in comfortable silence, sharing tasks that brought them into frequent physical proximity. Drake found himself hyper-aware of these moments when Frieda's hand brushed his as they moved furniture, when she stood close enough that he could catch her scent of lavender and earth, when her laughter filled spaces that had known only echoes for decades. "You're different than I expected," Frieda admitted one evening, as they shared dinner before the restored fireplace. They had fallen into this routine, preparing and sharing meals that nourished her while providing him companionship he hadn't realized he craved. "Different how?" Drake asked, genuinely curious about her perceptions. "The stories paint vampires as seductive predators, all charm and dangerous allure, but you're—" She paused, searching for the right words. "You're careful, considerate. You ask permission before entering rooms I'm working in. You worry about my comfort, my needs, my feelings. You're more courteous than most mortal men I've known." Drake felt heat rise in his chest at her words. "Perhaps because I remember what it was like to be vulnerable, to need protection and care. I would not wish to inflict on anyone the powerlessness I felt during my transformation." Their evening conversations became the highlight of both their days. Drake shared stories from his centuries of existence, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the changes he had witnessed in human society, the slow evolution of his understanding about his own nature. Frieda spoke of her healing work, her relationship with the natural world, her philosophy of finding beauty in broken things. The village council met again yesterday, Drake mentioned one evening, having learned of the gathering through means he didn't specify. Father Matthias is convinced that your escape was a sign of your supernatural corruption. He's been preaching sermons about demonic influence and the need for stronger measures against evil. Frieda's face darkened with concern. What kind of stronger measures? He's requesting authority from the regional bishop to conduct broader investigations into witchcraft and supernatural activity. He believes your association with me proves that dark forces are gathering in this area. The threat hung between them like a dispossession. Shadow. A reminder that their growing happiness existed in a bubble that could be burst by the outside world's fear and hatred. They had been so focused on each other, on the restoration of the castle and their deepening connection, that the danger from the village had seemed distant and manageable. "I won't let them hurt you," Drake said, his voice carrying the weight of an oath. "Whatever authority they claim, whatever backing they receive, I will protect you. And I won't let them use me as an excuse to hurt others," Frieda replied. "If Matthias is truly planning some kind of purge, innocent people will suffer. Those who still remember the old ways, who practice herbal healing, who simply think differently than the majority." As they sat before the fire, the gravity of their situation settled around them. They were no longer just two outcasts finding solace in each other's company. They were potentially the center of a storm that could engulf the entire region in fear and violence. But even as danger gathered around them, neither could deny what was growing between them. When Drake stood to bank the fire for the evening, Frieda rose as well, and they found themselves standing close enough to feel each other's breathing. For a moment that stretched like held breath, the air between them thrummed with possibility. "Frieda," Drake whispered, her name carrying all the longing he had been trying to suppress. "I know," she replied, her hand rising to touch his face with infinite gentleness. "I feel it too." They didn't kiss that night, though both wanted to. Instead, they stood together in the firelight, acknowledging the love that was taking root between them, while knowing that the world outside these walls would view their connection as an abomination. The vampire and the witch, the monster and the healer, finding in each other the missing pieces of their fractured souls. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new questions about whether their love could survive in a world determined to destroy anything it didn't understand. But tonight, in the restored warmth of Thornwick Castle, two hearts that had thought themselves beyond repair began to beat in harmony. The silver cross had been hidden at the bottom of Frieda's herb pouch, wrapped in a scrap of faded silk that had once been her mother's wedding veil. She had forgotten it was there until she was reorganizing her meager possessions in the chamber Drake had given her, and the weight of it in her palm brought back a flood of memories she had long kept buried. Her mother had pressed the cross into her hands on her deathbed, whispering words about faith and protection that had seemed so important in that moment of grief. "Promise me you'll keep it close," her mother had said, her voice weak but urgent. "Promise me you'll remember that being different doesn't mean being damned." Now, holding the cross in the lamplight of her chamber, Frieda felt the full weight of her complicated relationship with faith. She had been raised in the church, had knelt in prayer, and sung hymns with genuine devotion in her youth. But as she had grown older and her healing abilities had developed, the gap between the church's teachings and her lived experience had widened like a chasm. How could she reconcile her love for Drake with the teachings that branded his kind as creatures of ultimate evil? How could she square her growing happiness with the belief that supernatural beings were inherently corrupt? The cross felt heavy in her hands, not just with silver, but with the weight of generations of conditioning that told her love like theirs was impossible, blasphemous, wrong. Drake found her there an hour later, sitting by her window with the cross catching moonlight in her palm. His expression when he saw the religious symbol was carefully neutral, but she caught the slight stiffening of his shoulders, the way his eyes seemed to dim. "I didn't know you were religious," he said quietly, and she heard in his voice the fear that she might be having second thoughts about their arrangement, about him. "I'm not sure I am anymore," Frieda admitted. "Or perhaps I'm religious in a different way than the church would approve of. I believe in something greater than ourselves, but I can't accept that love is evil simply because it doesn't fit traditional expectations." She held up the cross, letting it catch the light. "My mother gave this to me. She was a healer too, though she was more careful to hide it than I was. She said that faith and healing came from the same source, the desire to ease suffering and bring light into dark places." Drake approached slowly, as if the cross might burn him. In vampire lore, such symbols were said to be instruments of torture for his kind, but Frieda had noticed that Drake seemed no more affected by religious artifacts than by any other metal objects. "Does it hurt you?" she asked, genuinely curious. "The cross, I mean." The stories say many things," Drake replied, sitting carefully beside her. "Some are true, others are not. Religious symbols have power only if you believe they should. I was raised in faith too before my transformation. If anything, they remind me of what I lost, rather than causing me pain." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts about faith, love, and the space between doctrine and experience. Finally, Frieda spoke again. "I've been thinking about what it means to be with you," she said. "Not just the practical aspects, but the deeper implications. You're immortal, Drake. Barring accident or violence, you'll outlive me by centuries. What kind of future can we really have together?" The question hung between them like a sword, sharp, with implications neither had wanted to examine too closely. Drake had been asking himself the same thing for days now, tormented by the growing certainty that he was being selfish in encouraging their connection. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been trying not to think about it, to simply enjoy having you here while I can. But you deserve more than a few decades of happiness, followed by centuries of my grief." "Don't I get a say in what I deserve?" Frieda asked, turning to face him fully. "You're not making this decision for both of us, Drake. I'm a grown woman who has spent her entire life making choices that others disapproved of. If I choose to love you despite the obstacles, despite the pain that might come, that's my right." Before he could respond, they heard the sound of hoofbeats on the mountain path leading to the castle. Multiple horses, moving at speed, approaching under cover of darkness. Drake was on his feet instantly, his supernatural senses already analyzing the threat. "Stay here," he commanded. But Frieda was already rising, her hand instinctively reaching for the herb pouch that held what few defensive preparations she could manage. From the tower window, they could see torchlight bobbing along the path, a delegation from the village, led by Father Matthias and accompanied by armed men. Even at this distance, Drake could sense the priest's fervor, the righteous anger that drove him up the mountain in the dead of night. "He's not just here to talk," Drake observed, his voice grim. "He's brought enough men to enforce whatever demands he's planning to make." As if summoned by the approaching threat, something else stirred in the darkness around the castle. Drake's enhanced senses picked up the presence of other supernatural entities, drawn perhaps by the magical energies that had been building since Frieda's arrival, or simply curious about the unusual pairing of vampire and healer that had taken root in these ancient walls. "There are others out there," Drake said, his voice tight with concentration. "Not human. They're watching, waiting to see what happens here tonight." Frieda felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Whatever was coming, it was bigger than just her relationship with Drake, bigger than Father Matthias's personal crusade. Forces were gathering around them, drawn by their connection, or perhaps by the symbolic power of their unlikely love story. "What do we do?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "We face it together," Drake replied, taking her hand in his. The silver cross was still in her other palm, and as their fingers intertwined, she felt the weight of all her choices, past, present, and future, settling around her like a cloak. They descended to the great hall together, preparing to meet whatever challenge the night would bring. Outside, torches moved closer through the darkness, and in the shadows beyond the light, ancient things stirred with interest. The careful peace they had built over the past weeks was about to be tested in ways neither had imagined possible. But as they stood together in the hall where Drake's family had once gathered, where Frieda had brought new life to old spaces, both knew that whatever came next, they would face it as partners. The cross in Frieda's hand caught the light of the restored fireplace, and for the first time since her mother had given it to her, it felt like a blessing rather than a burden. Their love might be unconventional, even impossible by the world's standards. But it was theirs, chosen freely by two souls who had found in each other exactly what they had been missing. That truth would have to be strong enough to withstand whatever trials awaited them beyond the castle's ancient walls. The confrontation with Father Matthias and his armed delegation passed without violence, though the tension had been thick enough to cut. Drake's supernatural presence and the ancient laws he invoked had been enough to turn them away, but not before the priest had delivered his warning about the growing investigation into supernatural activity in the region. As their torchlight disappeared back down the mountain path, both Frieda and Drake knew this was only the beginning. It was while cleaning the debris from a section of the castle's lower levels the next morning that Frieda made the discovery that would change everything. Behind a collapsed section of stone wall, her efforts to clear away centuries of accumulated rubble revealed a hidden chamber that even Drake had not known existed. The room was small, clearly designed as a private study or sanctuary. Unlike the rest of the castle, this space showed no signs of decay, as if some protective enchantment had preserved it exactly as it had been left centuries ago. Ancient books lined the walls, their leather bindings pristine, and arcane symbols had been carved into the stone floor in intricate patterns. But it was the collection of artifacts on the central table that made Frieda's breath catch in her throat. Weapons designed specifically for hunting supernatural creatures, silver blades, crossbow bolts tipped with blessed wood, vials of what looked like holy water, and, in the center of it all, a medallion that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The medallion was roughly the size of her palm, crafted from silver and set with a stone that shifted color in the lamplight. But it was the symbols etched around its edge that made Frieda's hands tremble as she lifted it. She had seen those same symbols before, not in books or on artifacts, but on her own body. Rolling up her sleeve, Frieda revealed the birthmark that had decorated her left forearm since birth. The pattern of lines and curves that she had always assumed to be a random quirk of nature matched the medallion's engravings exactly. As the medallion touched her skin, both the metal and her birthmark began to glow with soft, pulsing light. Frieda. Drake's voice came from the chamber entrance, where he had stopped short at the sight of the hidden room. "What is this place?" She turned to face him, the medallion still glowing in her hand, and saw his expression change from curiosity to something approaching horror as he recognized what she held. "That's impossible," he whispered, his vampire sight clearly identifying the medallion's significance, even as his mind rejected what he was seeing. "That symbol, that design, it belongs to the Van Helsing bloodline. The most legendary vampire hunters in history." The words hit Frieda like physical blows. Van Helsing, even she, with her limited knowledge of supernatural lore, knew that name. Stories of the great vampire hunter and his descendants had been whispered for generations, tales of a family dedicated to ridding the world of creatures like Drake. "That can't be right," Frieda said, though even as she spoke, pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. Her mother's unusual knowledge of protective herbs, her grandmother's stories about fighting darkness, her own instinctive fearlessness around supernatural creatures, the way Drake had seemed to pose no threat to her from their first meeting, as if something in her recognized exactly what he was and how to handle him. Drake approached the table slowly, his eyes taking in the weapons and artifacts with growing understanding. "This was a hunter's sanctuary," he said, his voice hollow. "Hidden within my own castle. They must have used it as a base of operations while tracking supernatural creatures in this region." As the medallion continued to pulse against Frieda's skin, she felt something awakening within her senses she hadn't known she possessed, awareness of energies and presences that had always been there but ignored. She could suddenly sense Drake's supernatural nature with startling clarity, could feel the power that flowed through his undead form like a river of cold fire. But rather than revulsion or the urge to destroy, she felt only a deeper understanding of who and what he was. The hunter's instincts that were awakening in her blood seemed to recognize Drake not as a threat to be eliminated, but as something more complex, more nuanced than the simple monster her ancestors had been trained to hunt. "The stories always said that the Van Helsing line died out," Drake continued, his voice carefully controlled. "The last known member vanished over a century ago, but if you're carrying their blood, their legacy, then I'm descended from people who devoted their lives to killing creatures like you," Frieda finished, the full irony of the situation crashing down on them both. "No wonder Father Matthias is so convinced I'm corrupted by supernatural influence. He can probably sense something about my bloodline, even if he doesn't understand what it is." The medallion's glow intensified, and suddenly, the chamber filled with whispers, voices from the past, speaking in languages Frieda didn't recognize but somehow understood. Fragments of conversations, training sessions, strategic planning. The accumulated knowledge of generations of hunters flowed through her consciousness like water breaking through a dam. She learned about the true nature of supernatural creatures, about the delicate balance between the human world and the realm of magic and mystery. She discovered that not all vampires were monsters, that not all supernatural beings were evil, and that the Van Helsing mission had evolved over time from simple extermination to something more nuanced. Protection of humanity from true threats while preserving supernatural beings who posed no danger to the innocent. But perhaps most shocking of all was the prophecy the voices whispered, a prediction passed down through generations of hunters about a time when one of their bloodline would find love rather than enmity with a creature of the night. The prophecy spoke of a union that would bridge the gap between human and supernatural, bringing balance where there had been only conflict. "There's more," Frieda gasped as the visions reached their crescendo. "Drake, there's a ritual, a binding ceremony that could change us both. You could become human again, and I could be freed from the hunter's compulsion to see supernatural creatures as threats. But, Drake prompted, though his expression suggested he already suspected the catch. "It's dangerous. If the ritual fails, if we're not truly compatible, it would destroy us both. And it requires—" She paused, reading the ancient text that was somehow appearing in her mind. "It requires the willing participation of both parties during a lunar eclipse, when the barriers between worlds are thinnest." Drake sank into one of the chamber's ancient chairs, his immortal composure finally cracking under the weight of revelation. "You're a Van Helsing," he said, as if repeating it would make it less impossible. "I've fallen in love with my natural enemy, with someone whose very blood calls for my destruction." "Have you?" Frieda asked, setting the medallion carefully on the table and moving to stand before him. "Fallen in love with me, I mean." The question hung between them, weighted with all the impossibility of their situation. Drake looked up at her, this woman who had brought light back into his darkness, who had made him remember what it felt like to live rather than simply exist. A woman who was now revealed to be descended from the greatest vampire hunters in history. "Yes," he said simply. "God help me, yes. Even knowing what you are, what your blood calls you to be, I love you more than I loved my mortal life, more than I've loved anything in 3 centuries of existence." Frieda's smile was radiant as she knelt beside his chair. "Then we have a choice to make," she said. "We can let our bloodlines, our histories, our families' expectations define what we can be to each other. Or we can choose our own path, write our own story, and trust that love is stronger than the curses that made us who we are." Outside the hidden chamber, the ancient castle seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what decision these two impossible lovers would make. The medallion continued to glow on the table, its light reflecting off the hunter's weapons that surrounded it, symbols of a legacy that might be transformed rather than simply inherited. The ancient texts, hidden in the hunter's sanctuary, provided detailed instructions for the binding ritual, written in a mixture of Latin, Old English, and symbolic notation that seemed to decode itself in Frieda's mind as her Van Helsing heritage fully awakened. The ceremony required specific components, herbs that could only be gathered under moonlight, water from a sacred spring, and most crucially, the ornate chalice that had been crafted specifically for such rituals centuries ago. The chalice was a masterwork of supernatural artistry, forged from silver blessed by both Christian priests and pagan druids, inscribed with symbols that bridged multiple magical traditions. According to the texts, it had been created by a Van Helsing ancestor who had foreseen the possibility of such a union, understanding that true balance between the human and supernatural worlds might require cooperation rather than conquest. Finding the chalice proved easier than expected. It was housed in a vault beneath the hidden chamber, protected by wards that recognized Frieda's bloodline and allowed her entry. But as she lifted the precious vessel, its weight seemed to carry the hopes and fears of generations, the possibility of redemption or destruction balanced on the edge of a ritual that had never been successfully completed. The last lunar eclipse, visible from this region, won't occur again for another 73 years, Drake observed, consulting astronomical charts he had retrieved from the castle's library. But there's a partial eclipse in 3 days, not ideal for the ritual, but the texts suggest it might be sufficient if our bond is strong enough. 3 days. The time frame felt both impossibly short and torturously long. Short because they needed to prepare for a ceremony that could fundamentally alter their very natures, and long because every hour increased the danger from external threats that seemed to multiply with each passing day. Father Matthias had not been idle since his confrontation at the castle. Word had reached them through various sources that he had dispatched urgent messages to the regional ecclesiastical authorities, painting a picture of supernatural corruption that required immediate and decisive action. Worse, his sermons had grown increasingly inflammatory, stirring the villagers into a state of religious fervor that bordered on hysteria. "He's not just targeting us anymore," Frieda said, reading between the lines of the reports they received from sympathetic villagers. "Anyone who practices herbal healing, anyone who shows knowledge of the old ways, anyone who's ever spoken favorably of my work, they're all under suspicion now." The irony was bitter. In trying to save herself through union with Drake, Frieda might have condemned others to the same persecution she had escaped. The guilt weighed heavily on her as she prepared for the ritual, knowing that innocent people might suffer because of her choices. But the external threats weren't limited to human persecution. The awakening of Frieda's hunter abilities had sent ripples through the supernatural community that extended far beyond Ravenshollow. Ancient creatures that had slumbered in mountain caves and forest depths for decades were stirring, drawn by the unique magical signature created by the union of hunter and vampire bloodlines. Drake spent hours each day patrolling the castle's perimeter, his enhanced senses detecting movements in the shadows that spoke of watchers and potential threats. Some seemed merely curious about the unprecedented situation unfolding at Thornwick Castle. Others radiated malevolent intent, viewing the potential transformation of a vampire into humanity as either a threat to their kind or an opportunity to claim territory from a weakened predator. "There's something else," Drake admitted on their second night of preparation, his expression troubled. I can feel other vampires approaching. Old ones, some of whom I knew in the early years after my transformation. They view what we're attempting as either blasphemy or dangerous precedent. If we succeed in breaking the curse of vampirism, what does that mean for their own existences? The training sessions that filled their days were both intimate and intense. Frieda worked to understand and control her awakening abilities, learning to sense supernatural energies without being overwhelmed by them. Drake taught her about vampire weaknesses and strengths, not as hunter's intelligence, but as crucial knowledge for someone who would be bonded to his transformed essence. The ritual will be traumatic for both of us, Drake explained, as they practiced meditation techniques designed to strengthen their mental and spiritual connection. I'll be experiencing something like death and rebirth simultaneously. You'll be having hunter instincts that have been bred into your bloodline for generations, forcibly altered. We'll need to trust each other completely, even when our minds are screaming that everything is wrong. The physical preparations were equally demanding. They practiced moving in perfect synchronization, breathing together, sharing energy in ways that would be crucial during the actual ceremony. These sessions brought them closer than ever before, their bodies learning to complement each other, even as their minds struggled with the magnitude of what they were attempting. As the eclipse approached, their conversations grew more intimate and urgent. They spoke of hopes and fears, of what they wanted their transformed lives to look like, of the possibility that they might not survive to see the dawn after the ritual. "I need you to understand something," Drake said on their final night of preparation, taking her hands in his as they sat before the fire in his private chambers. "Even if the ritual fails, even if it destroys us both, I don't regret loving you. You've given me more genuine happiness in these few weeks than I've known in 3 centuries of existence. Whatever happens tomorrow night, that will always be true." Frieda leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. "And you've shown me that love doesn't have to mean becoming smaller or lesser than what you are. You've loved me for my strength, my independence, my refusal to conform. Win or lose, that's a gift I'll carry into whatever comes next." They made love that night, with a passion edged by desperation, knowing it might be their last time together as the people they currently were. Drake's vampiric nature and Frieda's emerging hunter abilities created a tension that somehow enhanced rather than diminished their connection, as if the fundamental opposition between their bloodlines generated a magnetic pull that drew them irresistibly together. The day of the eclipse dawned grey and overcast, with storm clouds gathering around the mountain peaks. The castle itself seemed to respond to the approaching ceremony, ancient stones humming with energy, shadows moving in ways that had nothing to do with normal light patterns. Frieda spent the morning in final preparation of the ritual herbs, mixing compounds according to formulas that seemed to write themselves in her mind, as her Van Helsing heritage provided knowledge passed down through generations. The scents were intoxicating: lavender for peace, rosemary for memory, sage for purification, and stranger herbs whose names existed only in the old languages, whose properties touched the boundary between life and death. Drake made his own preparations, donning ceremonial robes that had belonged to his mortal ancestors, cleansing himself according to rites that predated his vampiric transformation. For the first time in centuries, he allowed himself to hope for redemption, for the possibility of reclaiming the humanity he had lost to another's misguided attempt at salvation. As evening approached and the first hints of the eclipse became visible through the gathering clouds, both felt the weight of destiny settling around them like a cloak. They had chosen love over fear, hope over resignation, transformation over stagnation. In a few hours, they would learn whether that choice would lead to salvation or destruction. The chalice sat ready on the altar they had prepared in the castle's highest tower, its silver surface reflecting the strange light of the partially eclipsed moon. Around them, the supernatural world held its breath, waiting to see whether love could truly triumph over the curses that had shaped them both. Father Matthias and his forces were moving up the mountain path under cover of darkness, armed with holy water and righteous fury. Ancient vampires circled in the shadows beyond the castle walls, some hoping to prevent what they saw as dangerous precedent, others curious to witness history in the making. But within Thornwick Castle's ancient walls, two souls who had found perfect understanding in each other prepared to risk everything for the chance at a love that transcended the boundaries between human and supernatural, mortal and eternal, hunter and hunted. The eclipse was beginning, and with it, the most important night of their lives. The eclipse moon mirror had been positioned with meticulous care in the center of the ritual circle, its ancient glass reflecting not just the partially eclipsed lunar light, but something deeper, more truthful than ordinary reflection. As Frieda and Drake knelt before it at the stroke of midnight, the mirror's surface began to ripple like water, showing them glimpses of their souls, his centuries of grief and isolation, her lifetime of defiant independence intertwining in ways that defied the natural order. "Are you ready?" Drake asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he took the chalice in his hands. The silver vessel seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, responding to the supernatural energies building around them. Frieda nodded, her own hands covering his on the chalice's stem. "Whatever happens, we face it together." The ritual began with ancient words that seemed to speak themselves through Frieda's lips, her Van Helsing heritage providing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of her bloodline. The syllables were older than Latin, older than any language spoken by living tongues, and as she spoke them, the very air around them began to shimmer with power. Drake felt the first stirrings of change almost immediately, a warmth in his chest, where his heart had been cold for 3 centuries, a loosening of the supernatural bonds that had held his vampire nature in place. But with that loosening came vulnerability, a gradual weakening of the enhanced strength and speed that had protected him for so long. The eclipse mirror showed them their true compatibility as the ritual progressed, revealing how perfectly their damaged souls fit together. Where Drake carried the weight of survivor's guilt, Frieda bore the burden of never belonging. Where she had been punished for her strength, he had been cursed for his loss. Together, they formed something complete, something that could heal the wounds both carried. But as the supernatural energies reached their peak, the carefully controlled environment they had created began to attract exactly the kind of attention they had hoped to avoid. The castle's ancient stones groaned under the pressure of forces gathering outside its walls, and Drake's enhanced hearing, still functioning despite the ritual's effects, picked up the sound of approaching footsteps. Father Matthias had arrived with a dozen armed men, their torches creating dancing shadows against the castle walls as they surrounded the structure. But they were not the only ones drawn by the ceremony's power. Ancient vampires emerged from the mountain mists, some drawn by curiosity, others by territorial instinct. Creatures that had slumbered in forest depths for decades stirred to wakefulness, sensing the fundamental shift taking place in the supernatural balance of the region. "The ritual is attracting them," Drake said through gritted teeth, fighting to maintain concentration as the binding ceremony reached its most delicate phase. "I can sense them gathering vampires, lycanthropes, beings whose names I don't even know. They can feel what we're doing, and some of them don't want it to succeed." Frieda's newly awakened hunter senses confirmed his assessment. Her consciousness expanded beyond the ritual circle, touching the minds of creatures that moved in the darkness around them. Some were merely curious about the unprecedented union taking place. Others radiated hostility, viewing their attempt to transcend supernatural boundaries as a threat to the established order. The eclipse mirror began to crack under the pressure of conflicting energies, hairline fractures spreading across its surface like frozen lightning. But the reflections it showed grew more intense, more revealing. Drake saw himself as Frieda saw him, not a monster, but a wounded soul seeking redemption. Frieda saw herself through his eyes, not too wild or dangerous, but perfectly fierce and beautiful in her refusal to be diminished. "Whatever happens next," Drake said, his voice strained as the transformation energies coursed through him, "know that you have already given me more than I ever dreamed possible. You've shown me that redemption is real, that love can transform even the most cursed existence." But even as he spoke, the sound of splintering wood echoed through the castle as Father Matthias and his men forced their way through the main doors. The priest's voice carried up through the stone corridors, raised in prayers that were more like battle cries, calling on divine power to cleanse what he saw as an abomination taking place in the tower above. The convergence of so many conflicting forces, the ritual's transformative power, the approaching zealots, the gathering supernatural creatures, created a maelstrom of energy that threatened to tear apart the carefully constructed ceremony. The eclipse mirror's cracks widened, and through them leaked not just light but something else, something that suggested the barriers between worlds were becoming dangerously thin. Frieda felt her hunter abilities fully manifest as adrenaline and supernatural awareness flooded her system. Every creature approaching the castle became visible to her enhanced senses, their locations and intentions clear as daylight. But more than that, she understood their natures, knew instinctively which posed true threats and which were simply drawn by curiosity. "We have to complete the ritual," she said, urgently, sensing that interruption now would be catastrophic for both of them. "We're too far in to stop safely." Drake nodded, his own transformation accelerating as his vampire nature began its fundamental restructuring. But as footsteps echoed on the tower stairs and inhuman howls rose from the darkness outside, both realized that completing their binding ceremony would require not just love and trust, but the kind of courage that could face down the gathered forces of fear and tradition. The eclipse mirror shattered completely, its destruction releasing a pulse of pure truth that rippled outward through the castle and beyond. In that moment of crystalline clarity, everything hidden was revealed, every deception stripped away, every soul laid bare in the moonlight. The real test was just beginning. The transformation phoenix feather was the final component, ancient beyond measure and glowing with inner fire as Frieda drew it from the ritual chalice. According to the Van Helsing texts, this feather had been plucked from the last phoenix to willingly sacrifice itself for love, its essence preserved through centuries for exactly this moment. As her fingers closed around it, the feather burst into flames that burned without heat, its supernatural fire beginning the final phase of their binding. Father Matthias burst through the tower door just as Drake's transformation reached its critical juncture. The priest's face was flushed with righteous fury, his holy water and silver cross raised like weapons against the supernatural forces he could feel but not fully comprehend. "Stop this blasphemy," he roared, but his words were lost in the whirlwind of energy that surrounded the ritual circle. The phoenix fire had spread from the feather to encompass both Frieda and Drake, wrapping them in flames that seemed to burn away everything they had been, while forging something entirely new. Drake felt his vampiric nature unraveling like a tapestry pulled apart, thread by thread. Centuries of supernatural cold were replaced by human warmth, immortal strength giving way to mortal vulnerability. But rather than loss, he experienced it as liberation, the weight of his curse lifting from shoulders that had carried it for far too long. Frieda's hunter compulsions dissolved with equal intensity, generations of bloodline programming rewritten by the Phoenix Fire's transformative power. The instinctive need to destroy supernatural creatures was replaced by understanding, the ability to see them as individuals rather than threats. Her enhanced senses remained, but now they served harmony rather than conflict. Outside the castle, the gathered supernatural creatures felt the change like an earthquake in the magical realm. Some of the ancient vampires howled in rage at what they saw as betrayal of their kind. Others watched in fascination as one of their number chose mortality over immortality, love over power. The younger creatures, those not yet set in the old ways, stirred with something that might have been hope. Father Matthias raised his cross higher, the silver gleaming in the phoenix fire's light. But as he stepped forward to interrupt the ceremony, something unexpected happened. The cross, instead of burning Drake or repelling the supernatural forces, began to glow with gentle warmth, not the harsh light of condemnation, but the soft radiance of blessing. "This is not possible," the priest whispered, his certainty cracking like winter ice. The scene before him challenged everything he had been taught about supernatural corruption and divine judgment. The phoenix feather crumbled to ash in Frieda's palm, its essence fully absorbed into their transformed beings. As the last of the flames died away, she found herself looking into eyes that were no longer crimson, but deep brown human eyes that held all the warmth and life that Drake had thought lost forever. Drake's hands found her face with wonder, his touch now warm with human blood flow rather than supernatural coldness. "It worked," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "I can feel it, my heart beating, my lungs drawing breath, life flowing through me as it did 3 centuries ago." The castle around them began to change as well, responding to the completion of their binding. Stones that had crumbled were making themselves whole, windows that had been dark for decades suddenly blazed with light, and throughout the ancient structure the sound of restoration echoed like a song of renewal. Father Matthias backed toward the door, his armed men clustering behind him in confusion and growing fear. The transformation they had witnessed defied everything they thought they knew about divine law and supernatural corruption. How could love between a vampire and a witch result in healing rather than damnation? But the priest's retreat was blocked by the arrival of another presence in the tower, Marcus, the vampire who had transformed Drake centuries ago. Ancient beyond measure and powerful beyond mortal understanding, he had come to witness what his misguided gift had ultimately produced. "You always were too sentimental," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. But there was no anger in his tone, only a kind of weary resignation. "I gave you immortality to spare you from grief, and you have thrown it away for love." "No," Drake replied, standing with Frieda at his side, both of them radiant with the afterglow of transformation. "You gave me immortality to spare yourself from guilt over my suffering. But true healing doesn't come from avoiding pain. It comes from finding someone willing to share it." Marcus studied them both, this vampire turned human and this hunter turned healer, seeing in their union something he had never imagined possible. "Perhaps," he said finally, "there are kinds of wisdom that come only with choosing mortality over eternal existence." As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with shades of gold and rose, the supernatural creatures that had gathered around the castle began to disperse. Some left in anger, others in contemplation. But all carried with them the knowledge that change was possible, that the ancient boundaries between human and supernatural, hunter and hunted, mortal and immortal, were not as fixed as they had believed. The phoenix fire had burned away their curses and granted them the rarest of gifts, a second chance at life, love, and the hope that even the most impossible transformations could become reality when 2 souls were willing to risk everything for each other. 1 year later, Thornwick Castle stood transformed beyond recognition. Where crumbling stones had once whispered of decay and abandonment, now strong walls spoke of renewal and hope. Gardens that had been choked with weeds bloomed in carefully tended rows, their herbs and flowers providing medicine and beauty in equal measure. The ancient stronghold had become what it was always meant to be, not a fortress of isolation, but a sanctuary where healing could flourish. On this particular spring morning, the castle bells, silent for 3 centuries, rang out across the mountain valleys in joyous celebration. Today was the wedding day that would make official what the binding ritual had already sealed in supernatural law and human hearts. The same chalice that had held the phoenix feather during their transformation now sat on the altar that had been prepared in the castle's restored chapel. But where once it had been an instrument of dangerous magic, today it served a simpler, more traditional purpose: to hold the wine that would bless their union in the eyes of both God and community. Father Benedict, the gentle priest who had replaced the departed Matthias, smiled as he prepared to conduct the ceremony. Unlike his predecessor, Benedict had seen in Drake and Frieda's love not corruption, but miracle proof that redemption was possible even for those whom the world had written off as beyond salvation. His blessing carried the weight of genuine faith rather than zealous condemnation. The guests gathered in the chapel were a testament to how much had changed in the year since the binding ritual. Villagers who had once called for Frieda's death now brought their children to her for healing, having learned to see her knowledge as gift rather than curse. Some of the same men who had helped build her pyre now worked alongside Drake to maintain the roads and defenses that protected the entire region. Margaret Foster sat in the front pew, her baby, the one whose birth defect had been blamed on Frieda's supposed witchcraft, now a healthy, laughing child. The midwife who had assisted at the difficult birth had quietly confessed that the complications had been natural, not supernatural, and that Frieda's interventions had likely saved both mother and child. Even more remarkable were the supernatural guests who attended the celebration. Marcus, Drake's ancient maker, had become an unexpected ally, using his influence among vampire communities to spread word that coexistence with humans was not only possible but preferable to endless conflict. Several younger vampires had sought refuge at Thornwick Castle, learning from Drake's example that there were alternatives to the traditional predator's existence. A pack of werewolves from the northern forests had established peaceful contact with the castle's inhabitants, trading protection services for access to Frieda's healing knowledge. Their leader, a scarred female named Luna, had become something approaching a friend, drawn by the possibility of finding her own path between human and beast. As Frieda walked down the chapel aisle in a gown that managed to be both elegant and practical, suitable for a woman who would spend her afternoon tending gardens rather than posing for portraits, she reflected on how completely her life had transformed. The herb pouch that hung at her side now contained seeds rather than just dried plants, symbols of growth and future rather than mere preservation of the past. Drake waited at the altar in formal dress that somehow managed to make him look both nobleman and gardener, his brown eyes warm with human emotion rather than vampire coldness. The year of mortality had aged him slightly, adding laugh lines around his eyes, and a softness to his features that spoke of contentment rather than eternal watchfulness. "Do you take this woman?" Father Benedict asked, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel. "To be your wife, to love and cherish through whatever trials and blessings may come?" "I do," Drake replied, his voice steady with certainty. "In this life and whatever may come after, she has my heart completely." When it came time for Frieda's vows, she spoke not just to Drake but to the assembled community that had become their extended family. "A year ago, I was condemned for being too wild to marry, too different to accept. Today, I stand here not because I made myself smaller, but because I found someone who celebrated my strength. This is what love should be, not the taming of wild spirits, but the joining of kindred souls who make each other stronger." The ceremony concluded with the sharing of wine from the ritual chalice, its silver surface now reflecting joy rather than supernatural fire. As Drake and Frieda drank, the assembled guests, human and supernatural alike, raised their voices in celebration of a love that had transformed not just two individuals, but an entire community's understanding of what was possible. The reception that followed was held in the castle's great hall, now restored to its former glory, but warmed by touches that spoke of its current residents' personalities. Frieda's healing herbs decorated the tables alongside Drake's carefully preserved books, creating an atmosphere that honored both knowledge and nature. As evening fell and the celebration continued, Frieda placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach, sharing a secret smile with her husband. New life was growing within her, their child, who would inherit neither vampiric curses nor hunter compulsions, but simply the legacy of parents who had chosen love over fear, transformation over stagnation. Standing together on the castle's restored battlements, as their guests continued the festivities below, Drake and Frieda looked out over the mountain valleys that had become their domain. In the distance, the lights of Ravenshollow twinkled peacefully, no longer a source of threat, but part of a larger community that had learned to embrace, rather than fear, what it didn't fully understand. "Do you ever regret it?" Frieda asked, her head resting against Drake's shoulder. "Giving up immortality, choosing mortality, and all its limitations?" Drake's arms tightened around her, his touch warm with human blood and human love. "Never," he said without hesitation. "Immortality without purpose is just another form of death. But mortality shared with you, that's more life than I ever dreamed possible." Their love story, which had begun with condemnation and rescue, had become legend throughout the region. But more than legend, it had become proof that the world could change, that love could indeed conquer the seemingly insurmountable differences between souls who were meant to be together. As stars emerged in the darkening sky above Thornwick Castle, two hearts beat in perfect harmony, no longer bound by the curses of their origins, but free to write their own destiny together.